All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's crucial conversations. We really appreciate you being here with us and for sticking with us during this series. I just wanted to make a quick logistical announcement before we get started. We will absolutely be accepting questions during the session, anything you'd like to discuss. If you could go ahead and locate your Q&A button for me, it should be at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. It might be towards the top if you are on a phone or tablet. So at any point during the conversation, you don't have to wait until the end. If you want to go ahead and type out a question and send it in, we will be taking those this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat?
Thank you so much, Annie. Good evening, everyone. As Annie said, I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I want to thank you for joining us for this second installment of our Crucial Conversation series on race and racism in our community. Through this four-part series, we hope to foster an increased understanding of racism in both a historical and contemporary context, and an awareness of concrete steps that can be taken to disrupt systemic racism. As a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, we teach our visitors about the dire consequences of prejudice and hatred, and about the dangers of indifference. We want our visitors to leave knowing that it is not enough to not do wrong, to be a bystander. Rather, they must actively work to do what's right, to be an upstander, to fight for their own rights and the rights of others. We come to this conversation not as the expert on this topic, but as a convener of individuals, organizations, and community partners that have been working to advance racial equity. And through this series, we aim to do what we do every day at the museum: learn from history, honor the power of personal testimonies, and share opportunities with a call to action. Last month, we started the why behind the series and defining some terms. Tonight, we aim to place race relations and systemic racism in Dallas in historical context. Before we get started, I would like to thank our presenting sponsors for Crucial Conversations, Geraldine Acuna Sunshine and Gabe Sunshine, and our series sponsor, IMA Financial Group. Thank you so much for making this possible and for supporting this critical work. I'm also proud tonight to recognize our wonderful community partners for this series. Bear with me, the list is long. Circle 10, BSA, City Square, Dallas County Equal Justice Initiative Coalition, Dallas Chamber, Denton Black Film Festival, Family Gateway, Human Rights Campaign DFW, Mosaic Family Services, REACH of Dallas, Refugee Services of Dallas, Remembering Black Resource Center, Temple Emmanuel. Grateful for our incredible partners and the work that they do in our community. And last but not least, I would like to thank our board of directors and our museum members for their continued support. We're very grateful for all you do for the museum. We have an incredible panel of speakers with us tonight, so I don't want to take up much more of their time. So I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our panelists for participating. Dr. George Keaton Jr., founder and executive director of Remembering Black Dallas and leader of the newly formed Dallas County Equal Justice Initiative Coalition, one of our community partners. Sol Viasana, attorney of counsel with White and Wiggins, LLP, and author of Dallas's Little Mexico. And Jody Voice Yellowfish, ambassador for American Indian Heritage Day in Texas and Indian Citizens Against Racial Exploitation, chair for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Texas, and member of the steering committee for Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And guiding our conversation tonight is Camila Collins, president of Collins Collaborations, a national consulting group and a great friend of the museum. Camila offers more than 20 years of workshop facilitation, program management, and community engagement expertise. Her creative and practical strategies bridge the communication divide and encourage accountability, and her enthusiasm and commitment to partner organizations inspires hearts and minds around the country. To name a few of the organizations that have worked with Collins Collaborations: Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Texas Women's Foundation, the National Urban League, IBM, Communities Foundation of Texas, and of course, Dallas Holocaust. As Annie mentioned, we encourage you to ask questions during this session using the Q&A button on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the program and at the conclusion of the conversation. I also wanted to mention that tonight's session is being recorded, so if you need to take a break and come back to the conversation, you will be able to watch that recording on the museum's YouTube channel in a few days. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Camila, George, Saul, and Jody.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to join you tonight. I hope that you will take away some nuggets and some kernels, specifically around race and racism in our history, our collective history. My hope for tonight is that we have a diverse panel with us, and that's for a reason. Oftentimes, we have an historic lens that leaves some of the story hidden or untold. And it's my hope that we tonight are able to surface some of those uncommon narratives in hopes that we bring us together collectively as a community. And so I'll begin tonight by allowing us all to introduce ourselves. Again, I am Camila Collins. The question that I will lead with is, what brings you into this work? For me, myself, growing up in Kansas, I understood at an early age that outside and beyond my home, which was an Afrocentric home, and my family and church and friends, I moved and operated as an other. I was in a predominantly white community. And a part of that meant that I wasn't always reflected in my educational experience, in my professional experience. I was often the only, or I was the outsider, or I had a slightly different experience. But part of that sense of being othered or being one of the only in a room meant that I needed to find points of connection to people. I wanted people to see who I was. And for me, that navigating and that sense of duality, or as W.E.B. Du Bois said, that double consciousness, right? The sense of I'm this way at home, but when I am walking throughout my day, I am another. And so part of that is, I believe in honoring our wholeness, our intersectionality, our identities that we bring to the table. And my communication skills, my adaptability have served me well, both in my education as well as my professional career. And so a lot of that is what led me into equity and inclusion work. That is what shapes the lens in which I view the world. And that is what makes me passionate about surfacing those unspoken stories, so that in hopes more people feel included, they feel seen, they feel heard, they have a historical understanding that may not have been found in the textbooks, but is equally as important to our lives and has significant impact for us as individuals. So that's a little bit about me. Again, Camila Collins. I am president of Collins Collaborations. And next, Jody, if you'd lead us with your introduction.
Yeah, of course. So again, my name is Jody Boyce Yellowfish, and I guess, diving into that question of, identity and why you do what you do and the work that you do and everything. So I think what to understand my experiences and the work that I do, I not only need to identify as American Indian, but to state that I'm Muskogee Creek and Cherokee and Lakota or Oglala Lakota, and set that, put that into the space so that, we confront those others, that to being that other. And Dallas is really unique. Dallas is a relocation site. So a lot of tribes are represented, not only in Dallas, but in North Texas. And there's not a large concentration in one area or one neighborhood, one side of town. Everyone is everywhere. So I very much can, I feel with being the only one, being the only one at school. And, if my sister, once my sister moved on, from elementary school, there were plenty of times where I was the only American Indian student. And, you have a sense of pride of being who you are, but you also deal with being alone or even lonely at times, dealing with that. And that's really complex issues and feelings to deal with when you're growing up. But that really shaped how I wanted to, as an adult, be active and confront and have these conversations. And, that's really impacted everything I've done, from what I've wanted to study in school, from how I organize, stances I take, places I speak, people I speak with. That's shaped everything that I do. I identify as American Indian, but I also will say I'm Indigenous as well, to show that solidarity, to show that we have differences, but a lot of similarities and a lot of the same shared struggles. And I think all of that, all of those identifiers are what make my work and my experiences really important in these spaces where these conversations are happening.
Thank you for joining us, Jody.
Thank you.
So do you want to lead us with your intro next?
Certainly, thank you. I was born and grew up in Dallas, and I grew up in Dallas is Little Mexico, so my experience is a little different. I mean, I was surrounded by other Mexican American families, businesses, and schools, and it's just this on the oldest and largest barrio in Dallas. So it really wasn't until I got to college where I began to feel that experience, that pushback. Where again, I'm the only one in the room really who has that kind of background, and looks different, sounds different, and certainly went to different kind of schools than people at the college I attended. So I wanted to I guess what brought me into really examining these issues is I wanted to know about myself and my family. I wanted to know, like, how did we, because again, we live in this rather kind of confined area, and certainly there was the white community around us, but we could actually stay in Little Mexico, go to the restaurants, cafes, and grocery stores, and bakeries, all that was there. So I really need to understand how we got to that point, and how we got to the point of also being so treated by the general community as a whole. That's when I began looking at the history of the Mexican Americans in Dallas and Texas in particular, in the Southwest, looking at the history of the Native peoples, of the African American community in Texas. And I don't think anyone who begins studying that history can't help but be appalled and just shocked by what you see and what you read and what you understand. And that certainly pushed me into wanting to become a lawyer, for not trying to learn from those experiences and hopefully make changes that as an attorney, and not let those things happen again to my people or other people here in this country.
Thank you for that. So I know for me personally, just as a cisgender Black woman, part of my upbringing was that learning of African Americans' history. And it was taught for me in my home from my parents. From an early age, I was able to understand that we are not monolithic, but we have great contributions that I actually wasn't learning in school. And so I think it's important for us as a panel to highlight and talk about what are the important contributions that have came from our communities, as well as us talking about those key historic events that folks watching tonight might not know about. Specifically, I'm seeing a question come from Charlotte, and thank you for your question, Charlotte. It says, Jody, could you explain what a relocation site is?
Yes, so the U.S. government, they had a relocation program for American Indians. And I want to say the Relocation Act actually passed in 1956. And what it was, you know, and I say it as vocational training. You know, people signed up from schools, different tribal communities. But what it did was it offered job training, schooling, even paid for transportation to get you to these large cities like Dallas, Denver, Chicago, Los Angeles. These were all relocation sites, and they have, to this day, have really large populations of American Indians in these massive urban settings. But what happened often was the distance was a way to almost assimilate, to get you off of tribal lands, get you out of your tribal community, not only with these offers of, you know, what a great future you could have, which was really intriguing. You know, these opportunities weren't available to tribal citizens at that time. So a lot of people signed up and were met with not a lot of options, not a lot of support. You know, and, you know, my father came to Dallas on the relocation program, and he wasn't even totally sure that that's what it was. He signed up from Haskell Institute, where I actually graduated from as well. It's a university now. At the time, it was just an institute, and he was a machinist and was looking for work. And so there was somebody that came and talked, and he thought he signed up for some kind of extended work from his schooling, and it was the relocation program. They gave him a bus ticket, sent him here. There was a boarding house, and in Dallas, there were spaces for families, and single tribal citizens came, and they were on the other side of town. So it's like, even as these single people, they needed that support and family and community, and it had to really be searched for. You know, and there was a relocation office here. There were people that were in charge of this program in this city, and even now I'm unaware of how the city acknowledges that, and if there is somewhere where they talk about it. You know, is it archived anywhere? I'm still unaware of that. So there's a lot when you have to deal with archiving our history. You know, like with the relocation program, archiving is all over the country and not in one central location. But I hope that I hope that was kind of concise to help understand what that was.
That was definitely helpful to me, just to understand that perspective and that experience, you know, and not only that, the documenting and capturing of that, the importance of that. George, I think that I saw that you were able to rejoin us. I wanted to acknowledge you. If you could give us a bit about you and your introduction, that would help us.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Holocaust Museum for this invitation and this opportunity to speak in behalf of, I guess, the African American community, or one aspect of it anyway. As far as myself, I'm a native of Dallas. I've been here. I'm a 5th generation on my maternal side and a 4th generation on my paternal side, on my father's line. So I've been in Dallas all my life and generations before me. And I've always had an interest in genealogy. First of all, is how I maneuvered my way into where I am. I listened a lot to my grandmother on my maternal line. She gave me a lot of family history and information, and that intrigued me. And I think starting in 1981, I became very interested and really made it a hobby, a full-time hobby. And I joined an organization called Black Dallas Remembered. And when that dissolved with Dr. Mamie McKnight, the late Dr. Mamie McKnight, I was able to reform something similar to what she was doing when I retired. And so that organization, I've been retired 5 years now, and I started literally exactly after I retired. So with that said, I was very interested in the history of Dallas, and I've been working in the history of Dallas long before Remembering Black Dallas. There was Black Dallas Remembered, and we did research and studied, and I just enjoyed and loved the history and the legacy and community of Dallas. And now I'm really putting forth an effort to bring out that history through the organization in many, many ways. One way is in literature, in writing, rewriting, or writing lost history of important African Americans. We actually did a play recently in January on 6 people that people hardly ever hear about, but they've done great things. And so these are the kind of things that we are doing. We're also promoting historical markers, and these markers and programs and plays and presentations, we're often called by churches and organizations to give presentations of the history of Dallas, because it's almost a lost culture that's being lost in the development that we so rapidly see going on around the city. So this has been a passion of mine. And then in the midst of that, in the process of trying to get a marker for 2 lynching victims, which was Allen Brooks, that led me into crucial conversations and I took the lead on the EJI, and we've started the Dallas County EJI program, a coalition rather. And that program it has conversations like this. That's the intent of Brian Stevenson, that each county recognize those persons who have been lynched in the nation. And there are probably over close to 3,000 or 4,000 between 1852 and 1920. And within that project, I assumed that I was just going to work on getting the marker, but I didn't know he had attached a community educational piece with it. But we had already been doing some dialogue and talk about race relationships in Dallas, because I've seen it all my life and I know what it's like. And so it was just an added piece, another added piece to what we had already been doing. So that's kind of where I've come from and where I am for today.
Well, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you here and specifically naming oral traditions of passing on our stories and our history, and also the work that you're doing and that you all are doing to ensure that the narrative continues to expand, not only here in Dallas, but to incorporate the voices and the struggles that are coming from our communities. With that, I want to open us up to questions specifically to talk about, is there something important or pressing about race relations here in Dallas that you would like to share or surface for people to know?
Is that to the panel? Or?
Yes.
Well, I'll go first. I think the race relationships here is slowly changing. It's not been good. And you have to keep in mind, it was just in the mid 60s, doesn't seem that long ago to me, but to some others it might. But there was really strict Jim Crow laws and rules that were still going on during that time. As a matter of fact, these kinds of instances have been going on, since Reconstruction, especially even in Dallas. So it's a slow process, and I see it's changing slowly, but I don't think it would ever change fast enough for me. But at the same time, and it's just not in race relationship. It goes across the gambit of job employment and housing it's a broader picture, and it's been perpetuated, you know, by the government as well. When we look at segregated communities and how that came about, redlining and so forth. So it's a broad, big picture, and it would be difficult to try to dissolve that in a few years when it took over. You know, I would think 400 years for it to happen. But the redlining is a serious problem, and discrimination on jobs, that's a problem, and it's still a problem. It was in the 60s, and now it seems to be has a rebirth for some reason lately because of the riots and things that we are seeing and the protesting going on. So that's, you know, we're still in an evolving state. I think the nation, not just Dallas, but in the nation, and this everywhere you go.
And now, George, you specifically named kind of the systemic injustice around redlining. For those watching that may not be familiar with that term, can you give them some context of what that means?
Well, redlining, a good example, first of all, I'm gonna recommend the book, The Color of Law, L-A-W, Law, and it outlines how government systematically segregated communities, blacks from whites, and even housing and public housing, white and black housing, they were to be separated. Black neighborhoods were not to be anywhere close near, first of all, their job, and then secondly, near a white neighborhood. So redlining is, and that's why we see now separated places. Even in Dallas, you have short North Dallas, that was a redlined area. And some of them were even freedmen's towns as they initially started, but then the communities, they were segregated simply because of what we call redlining. And the people who were in those areas, the bank would not give loans to those people, and they were just discriminated against severely. And that's how it is. That's how it was across the nation. And I've even read in that particular book, there was one community, they actually built a whole wall around the entire black neighborhood in California just to keep separation from the races. So that's a long example, a definition of redlining, but basically, I'm sure the viewers understand.
Yes, thank you. And again, that book is Color of Law. And it is talking about that geographical, financial division of Black communities and their ability to have economic mobility and be approved for loans. Saul, did you have something to add also?
Yeah, I think what's most striking to me is that the issue of the police still. That's, of course, Black Lives Matter has certainly been in everybody's mind recently. And it's good to see peoples of different communities coming together on that issue. But I remember 47 years ago when Santos Rodriguez was murdered by a white cop here in Dallas. And we had riots in the street, one of the first real riot we had, and there's nothing other way to call it. We did, because we were mad 47 years ago, and unfortunately, we're still mad about this. And it's something that's, I fear, really still is a very dangerous and an unsettled area still. I could see progress in the area of education for Mexican Americans, bilingual education. I can certainly see it with in the economic area and housing, but there's still this issue of the police and how they police neighborhoods of color and differently. And those differences, unfortunately, wind up with dead kids.
Thank you for naming that police violence that's occurring. There's a question from Amy, specifically regarding the Hispanic community. And she said, was there redlining happening in the Hispanic community in Dallas as well?
There was not the de jure, the legal kind of segregation going on, but it happened because in fact, many of the Dallas Black neighborhoods, early Black neighborhoods, were right next to the Mexican American neighborhoods. They were kind of butted up against each other, and we went back and forth with each other. It was because, again, those were the neighborhoods where rents were cheaper. They were older. Housing stock was older, but there was not that kind of de jure housing segregation that the African American community had to suffer through. the reality was we were living right next to each other, and we shared neighborhoods oftentimes. In fact, Dallas's Little Mexico, where I grew up, had been the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, had been actually a Jewish neighborhood. When that Jewish community began to move out, the Mexican American community moved into the neighborhood. So these old neighborhoods, and George can talk about that more too, they tend to transition oftentimes from one minority group to the other minority group. And so we wind up being very, very near each other oftentimes.
Thank you for that. Jody, if you don't have anything to add, I'll move into our next point. Another thing that I'm thinking of, as you mentioned specifically, neighborhoods, people of color living side by side, or both being impacted by the economic separation and division, and being around poverty and having implications and incidents with the police. I'm curious on what was that relationship. You mentioned a time frame, you both mentioned around the 60s, 50s. What was the climate between the Black and Brown communities at that time?
Well, as I mentioned, 1973, when Santos Rodriguez was murdered by that police officer, we came together, the Black community and the Hispanic community, in the protests that followed that shooting, and that was a good thing. You oftentimes see that even though we're living and working right next to each other, there was a kind of a divide. And one of the issues, I think, which might have been kind of a division, was the issue of the Spanish language. The barrios, the Mexican American communities, when we use the Spanish language, we always have, we always will. It was what brought us initially together, and in those kind of identifiable communities like Dallas's Little Mexico. So, but I think there was an issue of the reality that the Spanish was part of our heritage. We use it, we continue to use it, and I think oftentimes the dominant white society would try to put a wedge between us and Hispanics working with the African American community. We saw that a lot when it came to education. They basically would want us to fight over crumbs in the economy, and unfortunately, sometimes we did. And I'm so glad to see now, back to the police issue, of us coming together once again and understanding how the systemic racism is affecting all of us, and we have to do something about it.
Jody, George, did you have anything to add?
No, because he really covered it really quite well. But there is one small component, is that the African Americans and Brown, the Hispanics, they did work together on some issues, but also there was some Hispanics who did not want to align themselves with the civil rights cause of African Americans, and simply for whatever reason, whether it was not to be troublemakers or not to be associated with it, you had really two spectrums. But I would say the majority of Hispanics, they were disfranchised, so they were in conjunction with working with African Americans or Blacks during the civil rights era, which is the 60s as well. So there was a group of Hispanics who were not for that cause as well. And I'm sure there were probably some Blacks that were not in favor of working with Hispanics to move forward towards civil rights because of, just their own personality and race relationships. So it was somewhat, there were a few people on both sides of the fence, I must say, they didn't see it that way, but the majority did.
Thank you for that, George. Jody, I have a specific question regarding the Indigenous community, particularly because as we tend to frame race conversations, we do often hear Black and white. And then we also then add in this kind of proximity of people of color, and we hear Hispanic, Latinx, but now they have the term Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. What around that civil rights time and era, And even prior to, what's that experience like for the indigenous people? You mentioned the relocation, people coming here. What has that been like? What's that journey? What can you share with us?
Yeah, so when George and Soul started talking, I was really thinking like it's really hard for me to pull specific things from history to talk about the American Indian community in Dallas. I wasn't I didn't live through that time, but I've always asked questions. I've always been the one that wanted to understand. And I grew up in communities where everybody looked like me, but I was the only one that was American Indian. So there was those similarities, the same struggle, same neighborhood, things like that. And as I got older and I learned about like Santos Rodriguez, I started asking questions that I wouldn't hear just a whole lot. I would hear some people say like, I remember that, but it's like they were almost like, I remember that, but they didn't want to let you know how bad it got. That's how I grew up feeling. It's like they didn't want to let you know that it was a full-on riot in the streets, and I had to become an adult and seek that education out on my own, and find people from the Dallas community outside of my own community, like like Vicky Washington. She was like straight up just like, we had a riot. It was a riot, like just broke it down. And when I started to uncover that, I always thought like, where were we? Did we feel the same way? Were we out, with our anger and our, were we hurting for his family the same? And it's always been kind of mixed coming from the American Indian community. Like there were those factions of people that, you leave it alone, and then there were some that were full on, we have to support these causes. And I think that's the case in a lot of American Indian communities, especially urban communities, where you're from such a small community that you're afraid to rock the boat. And that's been a big thing. And I'm trying my hardest to be the exact opposite. I don't want to be that person and raise a family that they're not empowered to question and stand up for what they believe in. And I think the stories that these gentlemen are sharing are what I can pass on, living in an urban setting that aren't necessarily my lineage or my tribe, but it is my community as well, living in in a metropolis like this.
You specifically named Santos Rodriguez. Can you share a little bit about that for those that are joining us that may not be familiar with that story?
Me or Saul? Or Saul?
Either of you.
I'm sure. I was gonna say I'm sure Saul can share more facts and dates than I can.
It was summer of 1973. Santos was 10 or 11, maybe 12, I think, and living in Little Mexico and in an extended household with I think his grandparents were there. And late at night, the cops come, knock on the door, drag him and his older brother out of bed, take him over to a little filling station, and they were accusing Santos and his brother, who was a year or two older than him, of rifling a Coke machine for change. And they, of course, they said they didn't do it, and they put them in the squad car. And one of the officers started trying to extract a confession from Santos. And the way he was going to do that, and how he did it, was to put his revolver against Santos's head and play Russian roulette with the boy, and then blew his brains out in front of his brother. And that officer was tried and convicted and spent 5 years for doing that, and only spent, I think, a couple of them in prison. But that resulted in a lot of people waking up to how our police relations had been at a very low point for a long time. In fact, when looking into my book and writing the book, I was there. I was at that riot, but I didn't realize until I started looking and doing the research for the book how the relationship with the police had been bad for a long, long time. They would come in Little Mexico on Friday nights and Saturday nights, rounding up people, It was very, very bad. If you were living and on the streets at night like that, you never knew. The cops were not your friend. You knew that. And that if anything, you'd wind up in jail, at best, and maybe dead at worst. And a lot of bodies were not found. They were found in the Trinity River, maybe. But and we never knew how. We suspected, and the neighborhood suspected what had happened to those young boys and men. But it's only when a cop was caught red-handed doing that any kind of justice was had. You can say 5 years is justice. But in Georgia, I think you alluded to it earlier, that there's always been this tension, and the tension, it oftentimes spills over into some horrible violence.
Thank you for that context. I'm just kind of like processing what you said, because every time I hear the story, it doesn't get any easier, because for me, that story is repeated in so many different communities of color from then to now. And it's something that it's important that we understand that's a part of systemic racism. That's why it's important for us to share these testimonies, these lived experiences of people, so that way it cannot, because oftentimes you talk specifically about what I can refer to as uprisings. They're often called as rioting, but I refer to them as an uprising because it's in response to something. And quite frankly, I think us having this conversation allows us to illuminate some of the causes behind the why, the history, the precedents of what has been happening for many years in marginalized communities. With that being said, is there something that is critically important for us to know or to acknowledge tonight while we have so many people, eyes, ears listening, hearts open, that they need to know about the history here in Dallas, and about showing up as upstanders and being anti-racist? What should they look out for, or what resources even could you direct them to?
Well, one thing I'd like to kind of add to it that I think still affects communities of color, and sometimes it doesn't get mentioned, is just the environmental racism which goes on there. I mean, Georgia and I can talk about these neighborhoods we grew up in, and we didn't really think at the time that maybe there was a lead plant there, which maybe before our time. Or it was a garbage dump, like where the city's dump was in Little Mexico. Or there were, or the slaughterhouse and the railroad tracks that children have to grow up in. That still goes on. That still happens in communities. So that's a very worrisome thing. That's one thing if you're a teenager or a young guy or an older guy like me, you can do your uprising, okay, when you need to. But children can't. And growing up in those kind of communities where you really affect the health and safety of children, that's something that's unfortunately still goes on today, and we have to kind of combat that, because kids can't take care of themselves, and these communities are not safe for a lot of reasons sometimes.
I would just like to piggyback and comment on that as well, about what I think we people in general should think about, is that we have to realize that this has gotten this far because of people being complacent, being silent, and not standing up. Because when you think about the Jim Crow laws and how people were doing African Americans in front of their face when they had them to get up out of their seat, where were the bystanders? Where were the people who were against that? Yes, they were probably against it, but yet they did not support or help. From all of that period of time, you think about from the time of 1865 to 1965, over 100 years, there was complacent people who stood around and allowed things to happen. And that is still going on today. People are being complacent. They're either they're ignoring it or they're turning a blind eye to the injustices that are still happening to African Americans, the Native Americans and in the Hispanic, they see this. And it's just amazing that now we all want to do a kumbaya meeting, but where were you then and where are you now? It should not have taken George Floyd for you to actually see the discrimination and the hurt that's being inflicted upon Black people. It should not have just happened when George Floyd was laying in the street dying. It's been going on, and I can bet you 100% that everyone has seen misjustice take place, and yet they turn their back or they turn a blind eye and they ignore it. And they are living in the same environment with these same human beings who are no less and no better than the persons who are watching it. So that's my message, is that let's not continue to be complacent. And it should not have taken this incident for America to become actively involved, because it's time has passed and it's way too late. And we need to start being more and more active in calling out racism, calling out misuse, mistreat, and in every kind of way. And it happens in many, many ways, even in discriminations, just going to the bank. And if you're working in a bank and you see discrimination going between two businessmen, white man, black man does not get the loan. And we know why. It's not because they didn't qualify. And if they did get the loan, they're paying a higher interest rate. And nothing is being said about these types of things that just go on day to day, normal business day.
What frightens me is that racism today in the last several years has become okay again in a way. I mean, you've seen people now who will openly express racist ideas that George and I would have maybe recognized in the 60s, but now it's coming back into vogue. And that's very frightening. That's really very frightening. Of course, they don't call it that now. And the people who practice that with their policies and their attitudes and their language, but it is the same thing. It's the same monster that we saw decades ago, which has never gotten away. In fact,
it hasn't gone away.
It's gotten popular.
And it's across the board.
Yeah.
Police department, education, business world, all around. And there are complacent people who see this and not doing anything.
And so how do we then disrupt that? Because what I'm hearing is you're talking about the normalizing of hatred, of racist rhetoric. And so part of that is, as you both mentioned, the importance of intervention, of naming racism when you see it, but also taking action. And so part of this conversation is giving people things to do. What can they do to disrupt that? I also note that there was a question regarding food deserts. And what we're really talking about is structural racism. Whether you're talking about it from a police violence or you're talking about it through redlining and legislative policy, these are institutionalized racism and it's structural. But even the term of food desert, desert is a natural occurrence where a food desert is food apartheid, right? Just like you talk about environmental racism and people are being in places, placed to live homes in places that jeopardize their health and safety. There are also these places and locations where people are living below the poverty line and don't have access to healthy foods, right? So how do we disrupt? Because these are big systemic things. And to all of your points, this has been going on for since we've been here, or at least since the notion of an America existed. There's a genocide of people, of indigenous people that took place. There's also, all these systemic barriers that have not only dehumanized us, but disenfranchised us from economic and social and political power. So how do we disrupt that? We've identified some of the problems and the challenges, but how do we disrupt that? And Jody, I thought I saw you take you off mute, so I want to give you the floor.
Yeah,
first.
so it touches on, that disrupting factor, but also how you ask, like, what is it that, in our area, in our city, what we can do. And one of the things I think is the biggest thing is education. And if we can, quickly and bluntly just accept and acknowledge and, and acknowledge the fact that, we're on stolen land. Dallas was built on stolen land with stolen slave labor. If we can accept that history as fact and it be taught like that, it'll change everything. If we can get that out in the public, that changes everything, because that sets the tone for understanding the inequities and inequalities and the trauma associated with all that. Because, those things happen with violence, and that pain and the inequities and inequalities are passed down generation to generation. And it's extremely hard to escape that, to function healthy in a way that, can change things. So if that fact is accepted on a government level, on a city level, on public educational levels, then that can change so much. That can be the biggest disruptor in understanding racism and dismantling that racism and dismantling the supremacy that holds in place, because that's what still is keeping these things in place. The environmental racism, like Shingle Mountain, still is a big fight, still going up against city council now for, understanding the funding to take care of it.
If you explain and elaborate on that as well.
Yeah. So, okay. So like right now, Shingle Mountain, it's said by, our city that, the funds are there to take care of it, to get rid of Shingle Mountain, which is literally mountains of discarded shingles, and in the summer, these emit toxic fumes, and there's people that live there, people that have to breathe this in daily. And, it's understanding, having the education to understand budget, understand, municipal government, to understand that, what we deserve, we shouldn't be always fighting for justice. We should deserve that justice and the fairness that is associated with that, because, I'm waiting for Shingle Mountain to disappear, like generations have. But I think that core topic of the educational piece and accepting historical fact and inviting those conversations to happen like this, and not being afraid to have those conversations around racial context and racism, because it's important. Those conversations set the tone to understand these inequalities and inequities that, shape literally generation to generation. We have to see that change, and it's slow, it's happening. Saul mentioned, people are, like racism is almost back in vogue. They've been emboldened by a government that doesn't combat that. But the citizens and the people, I feel, are finally working together to combat that. I finally feel like in adulthood that I have communities, not just my own American Indian community, but I have other, BIPOC communities that have my back. There's community care and collective care, and, we're in these fights together. And I think that the core thing is accepting history and trying to heal from that.
Thank you. With that, I want to acknowledge that we have teachers and educators that are probably watching. And so are there resources that each of you might recommend, or even organizations that do this work to specifically elevate people's understanding of not only the historic context, but from the BIPOC communities, understanding what are the issues that are currently happening, and then the historic lens as well. So any resource and recommendations from the panel?
Well, I just like to mention, first of all, there's been a movement to try to get this education in the schools. It's not there. But there are plenty of resources on the internet as it relates to it. But as far as a teaching tool, and I know for a fact, coming from the Dallas Independent School District, that the curriculum is not there. And the focus and the force has never been on the history of Dallas, and neither on the history of the different cultures and races. But I see the question here, and as far as civil rights, basically a teacher would have to go out and find their own resources and do it themselves. But as far as curriculum in the school, the Dallas has never made a good effort until lately. Their focus has been mainly on testing and to test. But when it comes down to the cultures, the indigenous people or the Hispanic people or Black, it's very isolated in one time. And then I want to get back to your question before I go on with that. You had mentioned about what do we do? And I see someone mentioned that isn't redlining illegal? Well, wasn't Jim Crow laws illegal? And going to the bank. These things are still happening, and they're just being done in a discreet way or under the cover. And just like I mentioned about the two people going to apply for a loan, that's discrimination. And when we talk about redlining, yes, it is supposed to be illegal, but now look at what is happening. It's changing faces. What is happening is those people who have been isolated, discriminated against in a redlined area, now developers are coming in. This is a whole nother way of redlining. Developers are coming in and rebuilding those and raising the taxes. The city is even in on it. They're raising the taxes where the people who were there, they can't afford to stay there. And that's not just in Dallas. I've heard that, you know, even in other places that the places that have been segregated, isolated, developers are coming in and they're moving the people out. And so what is that but redlining? You're moving the people who were already there, and then now they can't go to anywhere any better because they're not getting anything for their properties, and they're being cheated basically out of a livelihood or a place to live, a decent place, because of the economics of housing has gone up so high. So yes, it is illegal, but it's still happening. It's just changed faces and taken a different form.
That's so true. That Little Mexico, Dallas Little Mexico is gone. In fact, they tore down the last house maybe about 6 months ago. Little home, little frame house over there. It's all glass and steel, skyscrapers and high rises, luxury high rises, and in the edge of downtown Dallas. And George is absolutely correct. I'm seeing, but like when Little Mexico was lost, we didn't have Mexican Americans in the city council. There were very few. And there were any African Americans on the city council. Now we do have people on the plan commissions and city council. We just have to go down there and rattle their cage all the time. You know, you really have to. And like the lawyer even says somebody have to threaten a lawsuit. You have to do that. You have to do it because you can't let that gentrification, those communities that are still there, be swallowed up by developers like Little Mexico was. And it is going on today. There are neighborhoods right now. Over in West Dallas right now, the little communities there, Mexican American and African American communities, are under attack by developers simply because they want that property to develop because it's closer to downtown. They didn't want to mess with it the first 100 years, but now all of a sudden it's attractive to them, and it will wipe out those communities, wipe out those neighborhoods, and those people will have no place to go. One last thing about what can we do? Again, the lawyer in me, I think you have to fight for the rights we certainly have. We don't want to see a reversal in voting rights or housing. You have to fight those things, and sometimes you have to go to the courthouse to do that. So I would encourage people to be sure to be aware of those things, understand that sometimes we have to go to the courthouse to get things, get these rights enforced, because even if they're there on paper, people will try to take them back and not let them be put into use by us. We have to constantly be aware and fight for every right that we have. Otherwise, they'll slip away and we'll lose them.
And I'd just like to mention one more thing, and I'll be quiet. But and he mentioned Little Mexico, but the most latest for African American is the 10th Street District. This is a prime example of, in my opinion, another way of redlining. Okay, houses had to be a certain amount of square feet, and what they've changed the law and now saying, okay, if a house is under 5,000 square feet, now what house in 10th Street or even in Dallas is 5,000 square feet? It's not considered historical. I mean, you can't deem it as historical. So what they do is they even change the rules and the law in order to take land from those people in the 10th Street District. There's no 5,000 square foot on those historical homes. And so they've removed the criteria, raised the criteria, and now they can go in and demolish historical homes in a freedman town. And that's one of the our last two of the freedmen's towns that are left intact in Dallas, and it's on its way out. And just like Saul mentioned, in West Dallas, it was not an undesirable area. Smoke pipes and everything, and the pollution in the air. And now it's a prime property because it's close to the river, and so is the 10th Street. It's a #1 place that people want. You can see downtown from across the levee.
And what you're both kind of touching on there is a lot of our present day issues and concerns, and definitely our hope for the next crucial conversation that the museum is hosting is around what is happening currently. So that'll be an opportunity for folks that are watching to receive more information about people who are actually confronting and upstanders and disrupting some of the injustices that you're highlighting, because they are not new. Some of the strategies and tactics to continue to marginalize the communities are more savvy or covert, but we want to highlight that. I want to open it up for question and answer for those that are watching as you submit. I do see the question from Barbara regarding specifically avoiding tokenism and increasing diverse representation. I'll touch on that just briefly, is that part of the way to inform our decisions and make more equitable decisions is by having diverse representation. But there also is an important acknowledgement that no one person is representing an entire community, because no community is a monolith. We have diverse, just as people are activists that are out there that you see during uprising, you also have people in the same community who are power brokers behind the scenes. So they may not be on the front line, and they may not even have the shared opinion of what is injustice or what is worthy of being fought for. So it's important when we're considering that notion of tokenism, is that yes, I can have an experience that may be shared in my community, and I may have an historical understanding, but also our experience versus our analysis is different. And so part of that is acknowledging that if we're intentional about including more voices and recognizing who is at the table and who is making decisions, and recognizing those decisions have broader impacts, that's creating the process to extend your decisions beyond the table or the people that are represented there is a critical part in avoiding tokenism, is that you are intentionally bringing in more voices, or you are asking the question, what do people want? What do people need? And being mindful of that. Going here just to look through your questions. I'm just going to read this because I don't want to paraphrase. Does accepting the facts of racism and discrimination mean accepting the blame? It's a conversation around, there's a consideration where I think George, even you mentioned earlier, this has been going on, and where were you and where were people when all this is happening? And there are people that are complacent even today. So there's this notion of people are not taking action because they don't want to take culpability for things that they did not do. So can you all talk a little bit about understanding and acknowledging history, and also taking accountability for what's happening or ways that we are complicit in racism?
Yeah, I kind of think like the word blame shouldn't even be in that conversation, because you can't blame oneself or yourself for something that maybe your ancestors did, but you can acknowledge that you have a privilege because of something that they did, and that's a powerful thing, to acknowledge your privilege, utilize your privilege, and utilize that privilege to uplift someone else's struggle, someone else's voice, those are how you step away from those feelings of blame, and, I have, and, that comes up a lot in my life. Anytime I talk about, the struggles that I deal with, or like, especially with missing and murdered Indigenous women, when I talk about, this violence, started when Columbus came and it hasn't stopped. It's upheld in many ways. And when I have these conversations, a lot of people, a lot of non-Native people, they feel that, they feel blame, they feel guilt. And, that isn't necessarily on that one person. And I think that's a topic that, like, it's not touched on often. We can throw around the word white privilege and to recognize your privilege, but if you don't recognize that that's an extension of those feelings of guilt, I think it kind of falls flat, and, a way to get away from that as well, like how you mentioned tokenism, the first thing I think about is, when I think of tokenism, I think about, tokenizing American Indian people. And, I tell everyone, that, if I get invited to an event, don't ask me just to open it up. Don't ask me just to pray, or ask me to just do a land acknowledgement. I have a voice, and I'm an expert at my experiences. And so I want to share that. So I think, combating those guilt and privilege feelings, like, because it's really complex, actually. You have to accept, those voices, not just bringing them to the table, but you have to accept everything that comes along with those shared histories and experiences.
Thank you for that. I see a question also. Again, for more information, you all have made some really poignant points about people being active, people holding themselves accountable, people taking action. Is there curriculum? So for those that know about, we talked about school curriculum. Is there any proposals that people need to get behind? Where can they go to gather information on that may not be in the textbooks today?
Well, I would think they would need to go directly to TEA. They are the people who are in the process of getting curriculum. And then individual, just like one woman, she called them out about some incorrect things about slavery in Houston. I think you have to, that's where I come back to it. It only takes one. And if you know how to get on the internet and go to TEA, you can find out the person that deals with publication and books. And Texas spends a lot of money on books, and I think sometimes too much, because what they do is they buy a set of books one year, and they make a deal under the table with the next company and the next company, and then they change books. But they need to also ask that you add this material to the book. I do understand and know that Dr. Delaney is on a committee where they are trying to, or attempting to be more inclusive with multicultural examples. And then also, I'm really concerned about in Dallas. And so me personally, and I'm working on curriculum with other retired teachers who are trying to get some of that history of our immediate history in Dallas in the books. But any person can look on TEA, Texas Education Association.org, I'm sure, and find the right person that deals with curriculum. And it is a great need, and it's always been. And even, but as if needing some now, as I said before, that's something you have to develop yourself. I remember in high school, my English teacher almost lost her job because she wanted to teach Black history, Grace Akbar, and she did teach it. She did teach Black history, and that was my first ever introduction to I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing. It was her that brought Black literature to me. And everybody in the classroom wasn't Black, but she made sure that she introduced that to those students who had an interest in Black history, and I was one of them. And those are the kind of things you have to do. And as a teacher, you have the authority and ability to present things that are recommended to your students if you can fit it in your schedule. If you're a history teacher, then you shouldn't have any trouble of introducing those things that might not be in your curriculum. and you have to tie it into ways that it might connect with testing for sure. But those are some things that you have to do on your own, because right now there is nothing there. To my knowledge, I've been gone for 5 years, but maybe it's changed. But it wasn't up until the time I left 5 years ago.
Just to add to that, I know TEA and getting curriculum, it is a process. It is a really long process. African American Studies was just recently passed. Like there is a curriculum now. Like, I mean, it is really new. And there is a process going on now for, I don't know if it's called Indigenous Studies or not. But yeah, that's a really big process. And just quickly, I wanted to add, if there's a state holiday in the state of Texas, like we have American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, that's the last Friday in September. If there is a state holiday, it is supposed to be mandatory that it's acknowledged and taught about in public schools. And that's why we did that, because we couldn't figure out how to get an accurate history in the history books. A lot of, you have to accept the fact that, history was written by the people that, came with force. History is written by the conquerors, and, and that's not an honest telling of things. So that's why we went that route to do that. We don't have a curriculum per se, but we do community work. And I think that opens the door for educators to understand that they do have they do have more power than maybe they believe, or people try to make them believe, when it comes to teaching an honest history.
And teaching history is hard, especially like in the early years, junior high, high school. I take my hat off to anyone who can do that, because so oftentimes it's as you're saying, there are false narratives, stories are not complete, what's in the history books is wrong, and certainly slanted and biased. I mean, well, if I were a teacher, I try to take things that are going on today that bring kind of history back into kind of a focus. The Confederate Monument, revisiting those after more than 100 years, that's been good. The false narratives about why those were put up have had to been opened up and looked at and have to be recognized. I'm not blaming anybody, but those were false narratives. Right now in Texas, of course, they're remodeling the Alamo. So what's going to be that story? Because you have the indigenous people who were there and part of the Alamo, certainly the Mexican American people, the Mexican people, the African American people there. So but right now, people are trying to distort that history and keep it in a false narrative that's old and stale and incorrect. We can't let those things happen. You don't want those things to happen. You don't want another generation of little children having these wrong, false narratives as part of their history.
Along those lines, I want to take a moment, if we could. Is there a historical figure that we should make people aware of in this moment? Is there a person that we should name just for the sake of educating people while we have their attention?
Well, I've named Santos Rodriguez. I think that's one that I think everyone can kind of
Thank
understand.
you for that.
As far as Dallas, I can say there are many that they're just not known. Most people probably know of Maceo Smith. He was a great civil rights leader. Very few people know of Dr. Edgar Ward. He was a civil rights leader, medical doctor, and he was born right here in Dallas. And also, it was included in the play that we presented. Matter of fact, just FYI, on our webpage, I'll pull a plug right here. We did a play, and that play is on our webpage under rememberblackdallas.org under our panel, under the tab of media. And what you can do is go there and see the entire play of 6 people that we highlighted that most people in Dallas didn't know about. Marcellus Cooper, who was the first Black dentist in the state of Texas. There is some debate. There was one in Galveston, but we're going to stick with the one that we have. And Remember Black Dallas have made efforts and did the application for him to have a marker. And most people don't know he was born on the Caruth Farm at Caruth Haven, where the Caruth Foundation is, and they're going to have a state marker. And I just happen to know his descendants They are still here. As a matter of fact, in that play, the descendant was his great-grandson who played his great-grandfather. So those are, it's just so many, and I could go on and on about historical figures that have done great things, but you don't hear about them. And most people want to say Juanita Craft, but there was more people in the civil rights movement than Juanita Craft.
And I think to acknowledge one does not exclude them, but it's just important, since we have the audience, to at least name a few folks.
Yes. Well, I'm gonna say Dr. Edgar Ward.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really hard to pick somebody. But I think when, being American Indian, I feel like it's extremely important to acknowledge where you're situated and where you're growing and living and thriving and fighting for justice. I think that it needs to be acknowledged whose land you're on. Like to know that the tribal names that where you're working. So it's, I think, like, and especially with the Caddo tribe of Texas, like we're situated in Dallas on Caddo land, not just Caddo land. There were other tribes like the Caddo, the Wichita, the Kiowa, Comanche. I think like those names need to be uplifted and learned, and even now, because Texas is a Caddo word. The Trinity is so important to our area. The Caddos called it the Arkakosa. It wasn't referred to as a Trinity, as a Trinity then. I think just those names, and not being a historical figure per se, but those words are very powerful in changing our current day.
Well, I thank you all for joining us. I do want to note that I saw several questions about identity and our preferences regarding how we are referred to as people, because there tends to be the sensitivity that I'm going to call you the wrong thing. So just acknowledging that the easiest way is to ask, right? I know for me, there's not a lot of confusion around if I'm African American or if I'm Black, or if my friend is Latinx or Hispanic, or if they're Indigenous or Native American. I think part of why I opened up and asking you to acknowledge and introduce yourselves is a sign and a show of respect to acknowledge your individual identity and your self-identity. I think acknowledging the land that we are on and naming it is critical. I think honoring the people that have dedicated their life to moving us forward, not only as historic figures, but just as people, critical parts of humanity, it's important. And so I thank each of you sincerely, Jody, so George, for joining me tonight. And with that, again, my name is Camila Collins, and I want to pass back to Mary Pat.
Thank you so much, Camila. Camila, George, Saul, and Jody, thank you for spending your evening with us and for your thoughts about Dallas history. This is these are such complex issues. How do you cover the history of racism in Dallas in one evening in an hour and 15 minutes? You can't. Okay. Hopefully what we've done is inspired you to dig in, to read history, to go to George's site, to read Saul's book about Little Mexico. We will send out some resources to you with our follow-up email. I also encourage you to go to our website and check out our Toolkit for Disrupting Racism. It's in the education section, for the teacher that was looking for resources. You're not alone. There are some incredible resources out there, and ours is a great starting point, but there are lots of other great resources too. I hope that you will all stay with us on this journey, and that you'll join us for the final two sessions. On September 10th, we will focus on the present and what racism looks like in our city today. You could tell from tonight's conversation, it's hard to focus on history because we're all doers. We want to fix things today. We were moving towards, forget history. What do we do today? We'll start to look at that at our next session. And then on October 15th, we'll wrap up this series by talking about the future, and we will include some concrete steps about what we can do to combat systemic racism and tell you about some organizations that are doing really important work and hopefully inspire you to volunteer with them, to at least follow them and make yourself knowledgeable and to be supportive of the efforts that they are making. I want to also encourage you to visit our wonderful museum. We were able to reopen to the public just last week. And it was pretty awesome to see visitors coming back into our museum to, learn lessons from the past to impact their behavior today. So please come visit us. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 5, and we would love to see you there. Thank you all for being with us. Good night, and I hope that we will see you in September 10th. Good night.